Hey, Composing Gloves here, and today we are going to be talking about binaural hearing and the two main ways, there's actually more ways that you hear and localize sound around you. So binaural hearing, all it means is that you hear with two ears. So you have two ears, so you're binaural hearing. If you have one ear, it's monaural. It's pretty simple. It just means one or two. So bi is two, so you have two, you're hearing with two ears. Now with these two ears, you are able to localize sound sources. That means you're able to tell where a sound source is in space. So if you have a sound source over here, let's say that there's two main methods you use to get to localize that sound source. There's actually more, but basically you have interaural timing differences, interaural intensity differences. And you need your two ears to do this. You see the sound comes into your ears, and then you, at the brainstem, you register you compare what each ear is collected, and then you're able to tell through a couple other functions where a sound source is. And so the first one is timing differences. So it reaches one ear before it reaches the other. It gets to your brain, and that's that. The next one is intensity differences. So it reaches both ears at the same time. However, it's louder in one ear than the other. So you say, oh, the sound source must be, that way or this way or that way. And so that's an interesting thing too. Vertical direction, I believe we have a 3-degree access, 3-degree accuracy, 3 degrees of accuracy. So we point up or down, you'll be within 3 degrees of accuracy for a normal person. And then laterally, with a normal functioning person, you'll be within 1 degree of accuracy. So you can pinpoint sounds using this pretty heavily. However, let's dive a little bit deeper. Now we can talk about things like, oh, well, what about beats frequencies, combination tones? Well, let's talk about frequencies in general. So we have these frequencies that are always bombarding us. We have high frequencies, low frequencies, and from Sound Synth Basics, we know that these frequencies have wavelengths. There are oodles and oodles of academic papers that talk about what I'm going to tell you right now in far more detail, but this is just general idea and concept time. So we have a couple basic acoustic behaviors that happen. And because this is binaural hearing, we're going to be dealing with acoustics getting into our head so that we can then translate it into neural signals. So if a waveform is that big, if it's a really high frequency waveform, when it hits our head, it's not going to diffract around to the other ear. Whoops, sorry about that. It's not going to diffract around to the other ear very well or very much. It's actually going to have a substantial volume reduction, an SBL reduction. It's going to be, I think it's like 30 decibels softer above like 10K. Like it's super soft because the waveforms are so tiny and your head is so big compared to them. But we have a timing difference and we have a huge intensity difference. But if we do things like low frequencies, like, 40 hertz, 60 hertz, stuff that's really low, those diffract around your head, no problem. Those wavelengths are enormous compared to your head. So I believe you can have them up to 8 decibels, and I believe that's still being pretty generous. That might even be higher. There are figures for this though. So it's way harder to tell where a low frequency is because the timing, now if you have timing difference, you might be okay there. But as far as high frequencies, sometimes they're so absorbed that there's other issues that come into play. Basically, in order to help identify where high frequencies are, because they're so weak when they reach this side, in order to get a really accurate reading of where a frequency is, your penna will actually delay different parts of that frequency. It will delay not different parts of the one frequency, but in that frequency range, because you generally have a whole bunch coming at you, it will delay parts of it. All the bends in your penna will cause that to happen so that you can more accurately point at where the thing is. And so we use these things. Now, imagine this. So those are the basic ones. We have interaural intensity differences, interaural timing differences, and then there are other ones out there that we're not going to dive into. We don't really need to. So now we've got these things like beats. We have things like, combination tones. We have things like masking. And now if we toss this all into a sound localized field, one ear may pick up stuff more clearly than another ear. So it's actually easier to mix things, to hear things in a sound field that has a whole bunch going on, because we can have these cues. We're given these stereo cues in this case. We could also have, if it's one speaker, then you can only receive it from one spot. So we're going to have more problems. But this also goes into the fact that our space that we're listening in will affect what we're listening to because of these cues. We may have cues that are wrong, things that are throwing the stereo image off because we have unusual reflections coming off of surfaces and things like that. So it's just a really interesting deal that I want to bring your attention to is this stereo field, the stereo image, and how we hear. Because it is, I don't know why I'm doing so much hand movement, but it's really, really interesting. And if you consider like just the amount of things you listen to per day, like if you play a piano, and we know that we get those combination tones, but now you can think about this. Those combination tones will then be different. They'll vary in amplitude depending on where you're standing. If you have a more even stereo field and it's got an equal amount of sound waves hitting you, so it's basically no intensity difference, no timing difference, they'll be way more clear. That's why on headphones it's really easy to demonstrate those phenomena. But if you're in a space, you're playing the piano, you're walking around, it's going to be really hard to hear those tones. So the piano is going to sound substantially different. That's why I think it'd be kind of interesting to have two mics that are approximately, I believe the human head on average is like 17 centimeters apart, or across anyways. And then it'd be interesting to like have that and then move it around in a room while recording. There are all sorts of weird things people do to get unusual recordings. They're going after effects like this. So anyways, that's a little bit about that. When you're listening, it's just another thing to think about. And now we can really start to get, as you can see, a lot more. So the more surround sound system you get, the easier it will be to mix, because you'll have so much space to give so many cues. Because if we mix in stereo mostly, so because we have two ears, so two speakers, kind of makes sense. But we receive stereo cues, or not stereo cues, we receive spatial cues, and sound localization cues from the space. So as things bounce around in space, so we can receive stuff from like back here, up there, down there. And so it's the reason why like it sounds so much more rich and full when we see things and we experience things in real life. And so if you have a surround system, you could sort of get some of that, but then you're relying on a mixer that knows about all this stuff. And then even then you're faced with the challenge of, if you're going to record this stuff, you've got to pick a spot to record it at. And then after that, you've severely augmented the reality. So people will sometimes go to great lengths to try and capture things as they actually are, a true surround sound image instead of a made up one. Sort of like how you can have pseudo stereo, where you take something mono and you simply pan it. Then technically you have like a form of stereo, but it's not true stereo. It's not really stereo. That really didn't happen. They're not true cues to tell you where something is in space. So it's a made up cue to give you a sense of space. So it's kind of a cool deal. If you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe, support me on Patreon. I'm wearing a hat, and have a blessed day.